Hello. I wanted to record these lectures because I thought it would be important for you to have this as a resource outside of class, outside of just the classroom. So what we're going to be talking about today is critical thinking and ethics in research. So to this point in the semester, we've been talking about the merits of doing psychological research, what it can do for us. And at the very beginning of this chapter, we discussed why we want to do research. We want to do it because we want to avoid relying solely on our common sense, on our intuition. Well, through your readings of the textbook in the history part of the textbook, you also were introduced to various roots of psychology, the philosophical roots. Ultimately, in the past, there were a lot of schools of thought before the science of psychology, the research of psychology started. The philosophical answers were very unfulfilling. The answers that we could get from the various schools of thought were unfalsifiable. They couldn't be tested. So ultimately that means there were a lot of answers to the same question. No one was necessarily that happy. And as we discussed earlier, like I said, why don't we just rely on our common sense, on our intuition? Well, the same problem arises. There is no way to test who's wrong or right. There's too many opinions out there. So what was developed was this systematic way to answer our questions. So research is this system. It's a process that can overcome the limitations of common sense, of philosophy, things like that. But the point of this lecture is to discuss why science shouldn't be taken blindly. We shouldn't accept whatever science gives us without first being critical thinkers, critical consumers of that science. So what do I mean by critical thinking? Well, this definition here, the process of objectively evaluating, comparing, analyzing, and synthesizing information. Basically, what that means is we need to question what we see, what we read, what we hear. And when it comes to the science of psychology, we need to be doing the same thing. Even if it's published in a very prestigious journal, even if it's being reported about in Time magazine or the New York Times or on the news, we can't sit back and blindly believe everything that we hear. So, not only in this class, being critical thinkers is important in all realms of life. But I want to present and kind of talk about how this process takes time. It takes effort. It's a skill that requires practice. So don't be too discouraged if you find it difficult to see science through this critical thinking lens. With practice, you'd be surprised how natural being a critical thinker really is. Whenever you hear or see something, you start questioning what's really going on here. And to help you with this process, I want to present a series of questions that you might want to ask yourself every time you're hearing something, every time you're reading something. So I'm going to present these questions relatively quickly, but then I'm going to go back and use an example in psychology that kind of demonstrates and illustrates these questions quite well. So the first question that we might want to ask ourselves is, what am I being asked to accept? The second one, what evidence is there that supports this claim, this finding? Are there any other interpretations of the evidence that I'm seeing? What additional evidence would help me evaluate the alternatives possible? And what conclusion seems most reasonable? So, to illustrate this critical thinking process, by trying to answer all these questions, you can come to a more reasonable conclusion about, should I continue to believe what I'm hearing or not? Well, like I said, to illustrate this, I want to talk about a few years ago, in 2010, 2011, some research in psychology came out that was actually quite controversial. It was done by a researcher at Cornell University, Dr. Daryl Bem, B-E-M. We will talk about Dr. Bem more so later on in the semester. But with regards to what was so controversial about his research, is that he was interested in studying what's called extrasensory perception, or ESP. A lot of people out there believe that ESP exists. Now, it can take a variety of forms. ESP can be telepathy, the ability to send and transmit thoughts directly from mind to mind, clairvoyance, the ability to perceive events without using the ordinary senses. What Ben was interested in studying was what's called precognition, the ability to foretell future events, something at least similar to that. So what Daryl Bem and his researchers did is that they brought participants into the lab, and they came in and they sat at a computer screen. And the computer screen was divided into two sections, and it looked like curtains were drawn. So think on the left side of the screen, there were some curtains hanging. On the right side, there were other set of curtains. Well, the task that the participants were supposed to participate in was quite simple. The participants were to choose which half of the screen, or in other words, behind what curtain a picture would be, a picture is. Now, the key to this study, how it's actually testing extrasensory perception, is that Dr. Bem claims that the software that he used controlled when and how the picture would be placed. So, most importantly, the picture would be placed randomly on the left or right side, and it would only be placed after participants already made their choice. So the idea is, the logic behind this is that when participants are behaving, when participants are choosing left or right, where's the picture? There is no picture. Only until after participants typed in their response into the program would the program then randomly assign a picture to be on the left or the right. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how is this measuring ESP? Well, Daryl Bem and colleagues were very interested in studying what's called retroactive influence, or the idea that the future influences our present. So to test this, they varied what type of picture was being placed behind the curtains. The independent variable was the type of picture. Half of the participants saw neutral pictures. The picture was a building, was a chair, pretty boring stuff. Well, for the other half of the participants, the pictures were erotic in nature. They were pornographic images. Now, the logic behind choosing that was to find something that perhaps was universally appealing. It wasn't something you had to learn to like, per se. So, to test ESP, they were looking for results that would find that people were choosing the side of the screen where erotic images were being shown more often than chance, compared to people choosing the neutral image correctly. So, in other words, people's responses, people's choices, according to Bem, would be influenced by the future event of choosing the correct image. And it would happen more often if that image was erotic in nature. So what's going on here is that we're no longer following typical cause-effect chain of events here. Cause leads to an effect. Not here. What Bem is claiming is that our future ripples through time. The power of seeing that erotic image ripples back through time to influence our present. Now, take a second, think about that. It's kind of a big pill to swallow. And that's the whole point. This was not looked at very kindly in the literature, in the field of psychology when this came out. Now, what you might be asking, what did they find? Well, they did find evidence of this quote-unquote retroactive influence. They found evidence that when the picture was neutral in nature, people were choosing behind which curtain it was at chance levels, 50-50. They were guessing. Statistically, though, we'll come back to that. Statistically, people were choosing the erotic image more than chance levels, around 53% of the time. Now, that's not a huge difference between chance and not chance levels, but again, we'll get to that. So, according to Bem, he published this article claiming that he has evidence showing that our future ripples through time to influence our present. Okay, so what am I being asked to accept here? I'm being asked to accept that a single study, a single paper, completely goes against what everyone, everywhere, at every time thinks they know about the laws of nature and of cause and effect. That's a really big thing to being asked to accept blindly on faith. Oh, just because it's published in a research journal, it must be true. Well, no, not necessarily. Well, what evidence is there that supports this? Well, there were a few studies that turned out significant. Is that enough? Do we need more evidence? Likely. There has never been any evidence of any area of the brain responsible for ESP. There's no way to measure ESP signals. There's no way to measure anything. And then all of a sudden, Bem comes along and says, hey, I found evidence. Is that enough evidence? This one little blip in history. Does that prove retroactive influence? Probably not. Other interpretations of the evidence. Well, were his findings just found by chance? Just so happens he had a sample of participants on the right day, in the right month, in the right area of the country who came in and just so happened randomly chose the erotic images 53% of the time. Quite possible. Are we witnessing something called the file drawer effect? Now, in science, the file drawer effect basically states that all the failures that happen in research are stuffed in a file drawer and it's never seen the light of day. Did Bem do this study 100 times and it failed 99 times and we're just seeing the one time it worked? Possible. Did Bem use a very, very large sample size? Well, I won't go into this too much, but statistically, it's a lot easier to find statistical differences the more people you run in any given study. Okay? So, the difference between 53% and 50%, although statistically different, is it practically different? Again, questions we need to ask. Well, what additional evidence would help us evaluate this? What additional evidence do we need? Well, in science, what we need is replication. We need consistency. We need to see the same results again and again and again, and we need to see them in different ways, using different populations, different types of research, using different materials, run by different labs, across cultures, across time, all hopefully leading to more valid, important, generalized conclusions. Now, Bem, if you go to his website, he is offering all the materials that he used. He's offering them free to labs to use. He wants people to prove him wrong. Now, I'll give him that. That is the correct mindset to have as a researcher. But no one else has ever been able to find and replicate this, at least not consistently. So what conclusion seems most reasonable here? ESP and precognition and retroactive influence exist, or the series of studies put forth are just a small percentage of studies that just happen to work out. What do you think? I tend to be in the camp that believes it's just chance. Other things are going on here. Now, I think this is a great example of how and why scientists should be critical thinkers of science. How and why scientists and the general public included, you included, needs to be critical thinkers. Because if we don't, we are left perhaps believing the wrong thing. Now, I want to provide this link for you, and this is just convenience. And I wanted to let you know about it. You do not have to go watch this video. But Daryl Bem went on the Colbert Report a few years ago. And if you're not familiar with what the Colbert Report is, it's Stephen Colbert on the Comedy Central has a comedy show. And Bem came on and he talked about this work. So what this video is, I think it's like an 8-minute video. It's Stephen Colbert making jokes about it all. But ultimately, you're hearing what Bem has to say about it now. Sifting through the jokes is one thing. But it's completely up to you whether you want to see this or not. I do not want to force you to see this at all. So just, there it is. So what does a critical thinker look like, and what does a non-critical thinker look like? Well, this silly example here might demonstrate what life would be like if we weren't critical thinkers of science. So research was done, and then the media wanted to write about it, and if we weren't critical thinkers of science, we would read the bottom story, and that would be that. We would say, okay, sounds good to me, I'm moving on with my day. Because typically that is what happens. One of my professors always used to say, what scientists don't do very well, but what we need to start doing is start understanding and talking to the persons in the street, the pits, as he used to put it. But the person in the street is not educated in all realms of science. The person in the street is busy. They're distracted. They probably don't care about any of this. But they read the news, they get online, they read something in the newspaper or Time magazine that says stuff like this, and then they start to believe it. Because you know what? Scientists are reputable. Scientists aren't lying. Scientists know what they're doing. So it's dangerous for us to accept things blindly. Even when it comes from the scientists themselves. We always have to be critical thinkers of their work. But especially when it's being described by third hand, by media outlets, other things like that. So again, a silly example. But just keep this in mind, because throughout the rest of the semester, I want you to have this mindset. Whatever you read in our textbook, whatever I talk about in class, whatever articles you read or anything, I want you to start trying to answer those 5 questions for yourself before you come to any conclusions. With that repetition, with that practice, you're going to start having the correct mindset you need to be a scientist, to be a consumer of science. Okay. So in this lecture, it's the idea of the ethical treatment of research participants during our research. You are going to be asked to participate in some research in this class. This research participation will be translated into a variety of points for your class. So it's important for you to go into your participation participation, knowing your rights, knowing what's going on behind the curtain, no pun intended. So, what are some topics that we should discuss? Ethics. We need to talk about deception, informed consent, and debriefing. Deception is defined as the withholding of information about the study in order to have participants be unbiased. There's a point of deception. So in other words, deception is not telling you the true purpose of the study, withholding information. The layman's terms might be lying, but with a purpose. Now, the point of deception in research is to keep the participants honest. We've talked about in this chapter already some of the biases that participants may have, intended or unintended. So the point of having deception in research is to allow the researchers to answer their questions in a valid way, in a pure way, because we can be somewhat certain that the participants were not trying to answer untruthfully. Because they think the study is about A, but it's really about B, they will answer as truthfully as they can based on A. But simultaneously, we're going to be able to truly understand B much better because they weren't trying to present themselves in a positive way. There weren't too many demand characteristics on them, and so forth. So deception is justified if it serves the purpose of answering the questions and there's no other way to answer those questions. So researchers always try to answer their questions without deception. Deception is only justified if there's no other way to run the study. Now, when you go into, because it's deception, you're not going to know it. That's the key here. We can't have participants know that they're being deceived. But what does happen in research is that participants come in and the first thing that they'll do is that they're going to be asked to complete an informed consent form. Informed consent is the idea that before agreeing to take part in a study, potential participants must be told what they will be asked to do and must be advised of the possible risks and benefits of the study. So, informed consent procedures happen in all studies, whether there's deception or not. What an informed consent process is that they're trying to tell you the task that you're going to be completing. Are you going to be playing a game? Are you going to be answering questions? Are you going to be standing on your head? Who knows? But you will know about this stuff before you agree to participate. You can't be asked to participate in something without you knowing what they're going to ask you to do. Now, that because you're being informed does not mean we can't also deceive you. The deception, it's a gray area. How can you be informed if you're deceived? Well, you can be informed of what we're going to be asked you to do, but we don't have to be necessarily that specific about the true purpose. The key is you will eventually know this true purpose during the debriefing process. So during informed consent, you will know everything, the risks, possible risks and harms that come from participating in the study, and you have the right to agree or not agree to participate based off this information. Then if you agree, you'll take part in the study, and at the end of the experiment, you will be debriefed. Debriefing procedure is when the participants are interviewed after the study to ask them about their experiences and to explain why it was conducted. So this is the time when researchers take to explain to their participants why perhaps they were deceived, what they were studying, what questions they were interested in answering, and so forth. And it allows the participants the opportunity to ask questions. It allows participants the opportunity to get things off their chest, to calm down if they were excited, to become more happier if they had been induced to be sad, so forth. The debriefing process is very important. It's important in all versions of studies, but particularly when deception is included, because the general point of the debriefing process is to let the participants leave in the same state in which they arrived. And oftentimes during research, participants do things that might change their psychological states. They might become happier or sadder or embarrassed or things like that. The debriefing process is that opportunity to get participants back to, if you want to call it that, homeostasis, that level, that same state in which they were when they first initially agreed to participate. Only then can we release the participants. So the informed consent process, the debriefing process are all necessary in order to protect the participants from what the researchers are asking them to do. Now, the American Psychological Association, the APA, has set down various ethical guidelines for research. Included in the guidelines is the idea that debriefing processes must occur, informed consent processes must occur. Well, when it comes to human participants, the idea of voluntary participation and the right to withdrawal are also important. What this means is that you should be free from coercion into participating. No one can force you to participate in studies. In this class, you're being asked to participate in studies for points in class, but you also have an alternative to participating in research. You don't have to participate in research to earn those points. So although we want to promote you participating in research, we're not forcing you. No one at any institution can force you to participate. But if you do agree to participate, you continually have the right to stop your participation. You have the right to withdraw at any time without ramifications. So don't think just because you sign that informed consent form, you are locked in and you have to be there the entire time. Although it is quite common, very common, of course, to finish the participation that you started, it's important that you know that you have the right to leave. You have the right to say yes, and you have the right to say stop. You have the right to say yes or no. I agree or disagree. Agree to participate, not agree to participate, so forth. You also have the right, you also are protected from any danger or harm to you, physical or psychological. All research conducted at this institution and other institutions go through an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. It's a group of people that sit down and assess every research protocol, every research study, and agree whether they meet these ethical guidelines. And one of the first things that they look at are the participants being asked to do anything that would put them in potential harm, psychologically or physically. You can be assured that if research is being conducted and if you're participating in it, it has passed this ethical guideline. You should be assured that there will be minimal risk, minimal to zero risk or harm to you. Debriefing should occur right away. Immediately after the study is over, you should not wait to be debriefed until the next day or the next week. The whole point is, remember, we can't release the participants until they have been debriefed. And your right to privacy should never be violated. What this means is that oftentimes in the informed consent process, you're being asked to identify yourself, to sign your name. But you should be also quite assured that your name is never going to be able to be linked to your responses. So most research is pretty innocuous. You're not really answering anything that important, private. But other research is asking sensitive information that you might not feel comfortable giving if you thought people could find out it was you responding. So the whole point of this guideline is suggesting that your responses are anonymous and they will be maintained anonymously forever. Your informed consent documents will be stored separately from the data. If there's any sort of identifying information in the actual data near your responses, it will be something like an arbitrary ID number assigned to you. Your participant 35. So ultimately, again, all these guidelines in general are trying to protect the participants from any sort of embarrassment, harm, physical, psychological, whatever it is. Now, APA also has guidelines for the ethical treatment of animals during research. Now, at this institution, no animal research is done as far as I'm aware of, but at other institutions, research with animals is conducted. So I'm not going to go into these in great depth, but I do want you to be familiar and aware that guidelines such as through a cost-benefit analysis, only when the benefits outweigh the costs will animals be allowed to be studied, to be experimented on. And the fact that animals are entitled and must have decent living conditions are all based off of historical issues that have arisen with the unethical treatment of animals. But ultimately think about animals as a very special population that don't have voluntary participation. They can't say no. They can't choose where to be and when. So oftentimes that's what these guidelines are trying to protect, sensitive populations who can't protect themselves. And although humans can protect themselves, psychologists know and researchers know that a lot of things can go into people agreeing to participate in something other than the person's real intent to participate. So these rights and these guidelines that all researchers must follow have that ultimate goal of protecting you, the participant. So again, please keep this in mind as you begin to participate in research at this institution, or if you go somewhere else. And when you become the researchers, you need to live up to these guidelines. And throughout your other classes, you'll learn more about this. This was just a brief introduction to these concepts. So ultimately, I want to thank you for listening to me ramble on about all of this. I want to remind you that all the information in this lecture, you are responsible for it. It will show up on the test. And make sure to read the appropriate areas in your textbook regarding these topics. So thank you very much.